Hello, Jonathan. Welcome to the Wax Museum.
Hello, hello.
So, you contacted me regarding your dissertation, A Theology of Consent, Mimetic Theory in an Open and Relational Universe. I find the whole thing fascinating because I really do believe the way we view God really drives the way we treat others.
Mm.
And if that's the case, we are far more better off seeing God as consensual rather than manipulative.
hmm
So you start your dissertation talking about origin stories. How important are origin stories?
Yeah, well, thanks for having me on, man. It's good to be here. It's always fun to talk about the work that you've just spent the last several years staring at the ceiling trying to figure out. And
Yeah.
even after published, still trying to figure out. By the way, I just got my first physical copy in the book in the mail yesterday. So that's
So
pretty cool.
cool to see the cover. It's like
I
kind of
know.
like a combo of like a Jesus fish and a infinity symbol almost.
You're very good. That's right. I worked on this for a while. It's an infinity symbol with a little heart. So
Oh,
we're trying
okay.
to get the idea of love, and how it's always with us. And when I kept drawing it, it kept looking like a pretzel. So I had to, and it still might, but I had to get my friend involved, and he made it look good. So anyhow, yeah.
That's
So
so
good,
cool.
good to be with you. Good to talk about it. And the question about origin, why is it important? I think it's massively important because as you tend to go from where you come from, and if you come from something that's reasonably intelligent and in this case gracious and full of love and mercy and space and grace to be who you might be, then you have a chance to evolve and to grow into something. And when you come from something, an origin story that's constrictive and punitive and shame based, which is what much of Christianity in the West, that's the kind of origin story. I'm probably oversimplifying it, but I think that's probably what much of the origin story is, and all about
Mm.
original sin, and it constricts growth. And so I think it's hugely important for us to look backwards enough to reframe our origin story and to say, you know what, actually, there's a lot of good. There's a lot of potential for, bad that we have to address, but there's a lot of good here, and that God is somehow infused in the middle of all of it. I think that's a great origin story.
That's kind of fascinating too. Like when you mention like impeding growth, I find that, when somebody says to me, God never changes, right away, I know they're a person that refuses to change.
Yeah, right. Because they're assigning to God what they imagine is going on with them, projecting onto it or with others.
It
So yeah,
seems
that's
that way.
yeah, I think that's true. Yeah.
Okay. So you talk about how Gerard says that religion doesn't inspire violence. It's much worse. Violence inspires religion. I love this so much, but I would love for you to explain that.
Yeah, so the work is built on trying to bring Rene Girard's mimetic theory together in concert with open and relational theology. And at times it was super difficult. At other times there was a lot of really interesting crossover. But Girard has this interesting, quite novel take on religion and on how we got there. And so maybe I should just briefly sequence it,
Mhm.
and then we can unpack what he means by religion inspires violence. And we can talk more at depth about this, but I'll just try to blow through it real quick so that listeners are kind of aware of it. His ideas are built on the concepts of desire, and that because we live in a relational cosmos, although that's not necessarily his language, but because we live in a relational cosmos, I never really know what my desires are until I see what your desires are, and so then I begin to want what you want, which
Right.
leads, for Girard, it leads to conflict or imitation. We begin to imitate each other, which leads to conflict. And then the remedy of that conflict, which is scapegoating. It's incredibly interesting, the stuff that he's come up with and what he's uncovered or discovered, depending on how you look at it. And then we scapegoat because it works, because we get to offload. I think that's a great word. In scapegoating, we're offloading our own psychospiritual drama, our own anxieties onto the backs of others. And then we're
Yeah.
getting rid of them. And it's cathartic. So it kind of helps us process our violence, which is connected to origin stories, because, again, a general origin story in Christianity in the West, or maybe even without, maybe even if we're not talking about religion, it might be a general origin story of humanity, to feel like we come from somewhere bad, or something's wrong, or something's not connected right, or there's a strong awareness of our lack. And so we scapegoat. It kind of works. It brings a sense of peace until it doesn't work any longer. The conflict, the antagonism always builds back up. And so we do it again. So Girard says that religion emerges out of this ritualization of continually returning to scapegoating. And the next time we do it, we might add new liturgy to it. We might say a different prayer, or recite a different pledge, or sing a different song. But we do it again, and we do it again. And so his whole idea here is that religion then is a way to really maintain and process our violence. It never really gets rid of the violence. It's like, it kind of works for a while, but it's like taking poison to get, to health. We actually make ourselves worse, which, by the way, that's pharmacy comes from the Greek word pharmakos, which that's what it means. It means literally poison and the remedy at the same time. So to try to answer your question, sorry, I just blew through a lot of stuff real quick there.
I really like that, poison and remedy at the same time. I think that explains religion quite well. And like
Yeah.
I think like the I also think it's kind of like a chicken and egg scenario, or even like when you talk about nature versus nurture, it's like I feel like it's both. And it's like religion creates all of this, you know, all this violence, but then violence creates religion. Like there's kind of a synergistic relationship going on.
Yeah, I think that that's true. And I think so. I don't know if I'll speak for everyone, but it seems like what we intuit more easily is that religion inspires violence, because we can kind of see
Right.
how our religious, dogma, the barriers that we've created, our strong awareness of the other people versus our own people. Um, it seems like we can see that easier, and we can see how that leads to separation and violence, defining ourselves as over against the other. What Girard says is he gives us a way to see how this is synergistic, how it goes together. That no, actually, and maybe a deeper truth is that religion itself inspires violence, because back to the origin story, because we started with an origin story that said we're broken, we're separate from God, God's
Right.
separate from us. We never had the sense that we're okay, that God loves us, that God is with us. Emmanuel,
Mm-hmm.
God with us. Imagine that God accepts us. The story we got was that something had to be done. And of course, that something that had to be done was that God's son had to be murdered, which, when you think about that, is a bit absurd, that God only accepts us or loves us, forgives us because blood is shed. That's a very unstable relationship we have with our Heavenly Father, if that's the reality. So to answer your question, yes, Girard says, because of all of that, I'm using different language than Girard might have used. Our religious activity, our scapegoating mechanism, continues to inspire violence.
Right. Wow. It's funny too, like when you're talking about like Jesus died for your sins, like it's a lot like that kind of toxic mother who is like being very like mean to her child. And the child's like, "You're being mean to me." And it's like, "I bared you for 9 months." You know what I mean? Like it's the same. And I see so much of that like within like Christian community, where it's just kind of like, yeah, yeah, this is toxic, but like you've got to realize all the things that we've done for you, or all the things that God has done for you. And it's like, I don't know if it's considered gaslighting, maybe bypassing, I guess spiritual bypassing, because it's just like,
Mhm.
no, you can't look at the abuse because I mean, you don't even deserve life.
It's so true. It's so messed up how we've bought into certain things, and we have not allowed our intelligence to evolve. And we're laughing in part. I hope listeners know I'm not laughing at, if you're still a part of that paradigm. I'm not laughing at you as much as I hope I'm laughing with you, because I was there for a long time in my own life. And but now, once you start to see these things, you can't unsee them. You can't go back, and you realize, oh gosh, yeah, our intelligence needs to evolve with all of this, and far too often it hasn't. It's very frustrating.
So it seems like you are implying that many of the problems with the God of evangelicalism is his separateness from
Mm-hmm.
humankind. You say separateness is a ontological impossibility. Please explain this.
Yes, yes. Um, I'll do my best. I wish I could completely. Yeah, the idea behind open and relational theology, and also the idea that undergirds a lot of Girardian thinking, is the reality that we, 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 we cannot separate ourselves from the world. We can't separate ourselves from the trees outside. I'm looking at, the mountains I wish I was looking at, but I'm not right now. Um, it's a symbiotic thing. We're interconnected with biology and the physicality of the world, chemistry. At a quantum level, of course, we know that it's just a wild, interconnected, entangled world.
Mm.
Al Whitehead, who informs a lot of open and relational thinking, is famous for saying, well, he says it about God, but it's true, first of all, about us, that we're not exemplifications of the world. We're not exceptions to the world. We are exemplifications. You come from the world. The world comes from the universe. The universe, as a believer, I think, comes from God. And that's what's interesting about open and relational theology. Then it will bring God into all of this. So God is interconnected in very interesting, well, all the interesting ways as well. So it's not a separate world. I don't think it makes sense, and I don't think science at all leads us to believe that if there is a divine, that the divine is separate from us, that comes from outside of time and space and steps into the situation. If that were the case, then what you would have would be this possibility of a God that doesn't need to suffer, doesn't need to get involved, doesn't truly interact. Well, actually, that's what we've had. That's what American Christianity is built on, whether people realize it or not. It's built on this idea of capital O omnipotence, top down hierarchical move, dominating move of God. That really isn't Emmanuel, God with us. That really isn't the one in whom we move and live and have our being. Move and what? Live, breathe, and have our being. Is that how the scripture goes? So, ontology has to do with being, and what open and relational theology says, and what Girard says in a roundabout way, is that there is no separateness to our being. Everything is interconnected. It's the only real way to look at things, and if that's true, there's massive implications between humanity, between our relationship with interpersonal, our relationship with the world, and our relationship with the divine.
Wow. Yeah, it's funny because I had this kind of like falling out with Christianity for a bit, and
Haven't we all?
I guess maybe I don't know. It's like, are you a Christian? And it's like, today I am.
Mm-hmm.
But it's interesting how I feel like I ran away. Like I thought I ran away, but it's like here I am getting all these emails from theologians wanting to be on my podcast, and I'm realizing I didn't run away and that God's been present with me through every step.
Maybe you've been running toward.
Maybe. And it's just this ever presence, right? I can look back and I see this ever presence still there. And I believe that ever presence is with, my loved ones who have walked away from the faith too. I'm like, I don't think that God has abandoned them. And oh man, my friend who started this podcast with me, Doug Watson, he and I were having a conversation. And he said, it's kind of interesting how the Roman Catholic Church is essentially structured like the Roman Empire. It's like the Roman Empire, inspired all the hierarchy that they have within the Roman Catholic Church. And he said, I would argue that evangelicalism is structured after capitalism.
Yeah. That's that's worthy of a podcast episode right there.
Yeah. All right. So here's a quote from your dissertation. In far too many cases, our most profound problems arise from the system that we've created, a system that blesses rule keeping and hierarchy loving adherent. Love isn't even remotely interested in such a system. Now, this is interesting because I see God as love itself. And so if she isn't remotely interested in such a system, why does the Old Testament God seem to be setting up rules and hierarchies? And I use the pronoun she because you use that in the book, in the dissertation, and I love that.
Thank you. I love that too. It occurs to me hearing you ask that question the way you read it. I had not thought of this before. I know what I'm trying to say when I say love is not even remotely interested in that kind of system. I'm trying to say that that's not how love operates. Love is, I agree with you. I think God is love. I think that's the truest, the best thing we can probably say about God.
Yeah.
I don't know that any of us know for sure, but it seems to me like that is the thing that's really worthy of our attention and our time. And I don't think love is, if that's true, then God's just not into hierarchy. God's already with this. It's a completely different way of looking at things. However, the way you asked that question made me think what I don't want to imply, which some people might read that and say, oh, well, then God, rejects that system, or God's not in that system. I actually think because God is present everywhere, that God is in the middle of that system too, in really quiet ways, probably at times, and in ways that are awkward and unfortunate ways that love is trying to whisper and invite into that system. So that's fascinating. I hope I don't imply that God's just rejected all that. Somehow love's in the middle of that too. And now I don't even remember what the question was.
Well, and I think like that, within that kind of hierarchical system in the Old Testament, I remember I used to always kind of look like, where do I see God in it? The God that I actually know, not the God that seems to be, smiting everybody. And one of the things that I kind of felt was a revelation as I was reading the Old Testament is like, it's kind of like a mother bear, protecting her young. And so there's times where it's like God is kicking some butt, but it's kind of like, well, maybe it's the mother bear kind of mentality. That said, I think there's a lot of violence in the Old Testament that I'm like, I just don't think this serves any benefit for me right now and how I see things.
Yeah. Yeah. Your question opens doors, to like biblical inerrancy and biblicism and how serious to take certain parts of the scripture. I'm of the mindset that even the strictest biblicists, if they're honest and they really take a look at what they're doing, they're making judgment calls about how to interpret some of these things too, because you cannot, it's untenable. You cannot, for example, say, I follow everything the Bible says, but then not go kill a gay person because, Leviticus suggests that that's what you're supposed to do. Like some of these things are just untenable.
Yeah.
So in terms of where is God in the Old Testament, I think it's, kind of a general way to respond to that question is, I think that, the Bible was written by men. Whenever God decided that was going to be the case, that he or she knew right from the beginning, okay, well, this is going to be filtered all through the constructs that these men are bringing. And unfortunately, they bring a lot of violence because we have, back to Girard's stuff, we've built our culture upon the scapegoating mechanism. I think that's true. And we have a lot of violence we haven't processed. And so, yeah, we just project that onto God, and we assume God's on our side. And so he's going to smite all the enemies, and et cetera, et cetera. It's an unfortunate, thing, but a lot of people have to weed through all of that in order to get to love, or love has to weed through all of that in order to get to us.
Yeah, I there's times where I just replace the word God with love, and
Me
I just
too.
think that's such a cool thing.
Me too.
I think I heard in a podcast, actually, it's called Podcast Made Flesh, which is actually my pastor's podcast.
Oh, that's cool.
And I'm back in church, and I love this new church. And one of the things that one of her guests said was the opposite of presence is projection. And I'm like, that is so interesting, because it's like, I think we do a lot of that. And this kind of ties into to like a future podcast that I'm going to be doing with the Four Hands. I don't know if I'm saying their last name right. Four Hands. I think so.
Yeah, I think so.
But
Carl
their book Out into the Wilderness,
Yeah.
and it talks about it's like intellectual listening versus contemplative listening. And so like when I'm in a relationship with someone, instead of me trying to show how smart I am, it's actually taking the time to fully understand that person and not trying to show how smart I am. And I feel like that's something that's really missing from the faith right now is listening. How do we listen well, and how do we contemplate and just be in the moment?
Mm-hmm. I do too. The problem is I just wrote an 80,000 word book. So I don't know if I'm listening very well. I'm using a lot of words, but that's a really interesting. The opposite of presence is projection.
Mm-hmm.
That might be true. Like if you think in terms of projecting your stuff onto the other person, it's a way to kind of control. One way to look at it is it's a way to kind of control them and distance yourself. And when you see things you don't like, which is what often happens when we project, we're putting the things we don't like onto them. So when we don't like it, it just justifies our scapegoating response to it all. That's a totally different thing than just being present, just knowing that from the beginning, it's okay. My stuff, my anxiety and my problems and your anxiety, your problem, it's all a part. Everything belongs. Sounds like something Father Richard Rohr would say. Everything belongs in here. And it's not always great. It's not always the healthiest, but yeah, it's a part of who we are.
Yeah. Okay. Another quote. A consensual God empowers us to participate with love in crafting a more imaginative and hopeful way forward. So I really like this because it feels looser, and it feels a lot more like actual relationship. Reading this got me thinking about how what we believe about God really forms whom we become. This is kind of my obsession. I just keep thinking about how we see God, it forms us.
Yeah.
And so if God can be like this, we can be like this to others. It seems so hard for evangelicals to give people this kind of space in relationships. And I think, again, it's like that projecting versus presence. Do you see that? Like, do you see that in relationships, in kind of those evangelical communities?
Yeah, well, I think the larger thing that you're saying is, I think, is true. How we see God tends to be how we see others, and how we see others tends to be how we see God. Girard will say things like, well, actually, I don't know if he says this exactly, but so I don't want to misappropriate the quote. But the idea is, good anthropology will lead to good theology, and good theology leads to good anthropology.
Ooh.
They're so interconnected, and
yeah,
and nothing could be more open and relational than that whole idea too,
Mm.
because otherwise we spend our time projecting and transferring is another psychodynamic word that's similar to projecting, and pretending as if we are separate. But as we've already discussed, ontologically, that's an impossibility.
Yeah.
We are not separate.
Yeah.
That's not to say that there aren't certain boundaries, and that's a really fascinating subject in and of itself that we have to be aware of and we have to set and stuff. But yeah, we're kind of in this together, and you're right. Evangelical world has done a really bad job of that. Unfortunately, I've been a part of it for much of my life, and I don't know that I've helped. Although officially, I'm out of it now because they certainly uninvited me from the group. But yeah, it's a tough thing as a human to be able to stay integrated and incorporate all of this inside of us.
Yeah.
Challenging work, man.
I love so mimetic theory. I like how you compared it to marketing and how marketing affects us. I think this like
Mm-hmm.
better illustrates what
Mm-hmm.
mimetic theory is. Could you go into that a little bit? Just how we
Yeah.
see someone slightly more attractive than us?
Right. Right. Yeah. This is the fundamental, probably move that the entire marketing industry makes. They have figured out they don't tell you what kind of, let's say, tennis shoes you want to wear. They tell you what kind of tennis shoes your model wants to wear. And
Mm-hmm.
so then you begin to desire them. Of course, when I say that, one of my classic go-to mimetic marketing examples is, it dates me a little bit, but is the Be Like Mike commercials that were out a couple of decades ago when Michael Jordan was at the height of his thing. Whether it was the shoes or the Gatorade, or any number of things, McDonald's. And I think it was the Gatorade campaign that was Be Like Mike. I want to be like Mike. That was the whole thing. It had nothing to do with the benefits of the particular drink. It had everything to do with the advertisers recognizing that all of us saw in Michael Jordan what the philosopher might say would be a non-lacking subject. We assume this person had no lack. I mean, of course, we
Mm.
don't say those words, but that's how we act. And then we're intensely aware of our own lack and where we fall short. And so we want to be like this person because, according to Girard, because that's the way we want what they have, because then we're going to feel better about ourselves. Girard takes it even further. It's not so much even that we want what that person has. Eventually, we want to become them. Eventually, we want to subsume them. Subsume is probably more of an innocent word. It might be even more violent than that. Like, we want to dominate that person eventually, because our own fundamental awareness of the lack that we have, drives us so much. This marks so much of the advertising marketing. We're all formed by this. Capitalism is formed by this. I actually think it is a part of the mark of the beast. We've been
Mm.
marked by this awareness that the other person has got everything. And you're right. Yeah, they're usually a little bit better looking. They're usually a little bit more affluent. That's how it gets our attention. They got whatever it is, they're kind of put together better than we are. Of course, the irony is the people in these advertising campaigns, including even people like Michael Jordan, since we've already brought him up, he's at home doing the same kind of stuff. He's at home looking at other models, and the mimetic energy is, coursing through his body just as much as anyone else. I mean, for sure, he's looking at Larry Bird or Kobe Bryant. Again, these are all older players, but the same thing goes on, with younger players and all of us. So it's a whole like boiling cauldron of mimetic energy. That's what the entire world is.
Huh. It's interesting. It's funny. I keep thinking of like capitalism and like, just like I just moved into a new house. We just built a sunroom. And I'm like, why do I have all this stuff? Right.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And like, been like, I try to explore different points of view on things. And a lot of the like on the extreme end of things, people are like, the World Economic Forum, says that you are going to own nothing and be happy. And I'm like, that sounds really nice, actually. And it's kind of like, how do we actually break out of, all of this comparison and trying to impress people with everything?
Yeah, it's a great question. It's interesting. I do 2 Monday nights a month. In fact, we're meeting tonight. I do an in-person thing at a local brewery here in town. And this will be the third session in a row. I've entitled it Overcoming the Memetic Shadow.
Mm-hmm.
And it's all about trying to figure out ways that we can not defeat mimesis, because there is no such thing. We're all marked by this. We're all created and formed by this memetic energy. Human beings are incredibly good at imitating other people. You'll see this in babies and toddlers as they grow up. It's part of what has made our species so successful, if that's the right word, in so many ways. So it's very much a part of who we are. I think there's probably a bunch of answers, but I'll just list a couple, three of them. I think self-awareness is extremely important to begin with, to be self-aware of why it is I'm feeling. For example, when I'm around certain people, why afterwards do I feel the way I feel? And it could be good or bad. Let's say bad. Let's say, as I'm thinking of some people in my life right now, why is it that I don't look forward to going to have coffee with them? What is it
Mm.
about the energy that is exchanged between us that leaves me always feeling afterwards like I don't measure up or I need to do more?
Mm.
Well, as I've grown in my ability to recognize mimetic energy, I've realized that generally speaking, sometimes it's because I bring my own garbage into this. Sometimes I bring my own, awareness of my own shortcomings and lack into it. And I project all this garbage into the relationship. Other times it's because I recognize the other person is probably doing that. Whatever the case is, whether it's their fault or my fault, you never really know for sure. What I see happening is an increase in competition or comparison. Those
Mm.
things are pretty similar. Feels like this is anecdotal, by the way. I don't know that there's data out there about this, but feels like the masculine part of us really is caught up in competitiveness, and the feminine part of us is really caught up in comparison. But at the end of the day, they're kind of the same thing, and we wind up competing and playing our own accomplishments off of the other, and it's this reciprocal back and forth, doubling. It's the symmetry of antagonism that I talk about in the book. It's not our differences that drive us; it's our sameness. That's a
Mm.
profound Girardian insight. So, so you asked, and I'm rambling, but you asked, how do we get over this? I mean, one way is continue to cultivate a self-awareness of what is it about my relationship with this person. And I've even gone as far in the last couple of years to really go out of my way to recognize those people that I sense I'm not in competition with, and I'll tell them that. It's always a fun conversation too, because it often opens the doors to begin to talk about Girardian stuff. But I'll say things to the person like, "Hey, I realized on the way over here to this lunch, I was really looking forward to being with you." And I started to think, wonder what that is. And then my next thought was, oh, it's because I never feel like I'm in competition with you.
Mm.
I just want to tell you thank you for that. And thank you for being present, back to our earlier conversation, not projecting stuff onto me. Thank you for just being a good friend. And probably not surprisingly, I don't have, I think, as many of those kinds of friends as I do the other. But all of that has helped me begin to overcome the mimetic shadow. And I said I would offer up a couple three, but I better stop. That was just one.
It's interesting because I think about the people that I don't like being with, and I think it's usually people who are wanting to be something that I'm not. Like it's like they think they're in competition, or yeah, I think that's it. And I'm just kind of like, no, you and I do totally different things. So it's like I don't need to be, whatever you want me to be. And I guess
Mm-hmm.
I've kind of gotten to a space where I just like what I do is unique.
Mm-hmm.
And
Mm-hmm.
so I don't tend to compare myself to others because I just feel like I'm weird enough that I don't need to do that. I would imagine
So
in
yeah,
academia or academia, um,
the
it's
academy.
different, right? Like in the academy, in the learnings. Um,
Well, so what I would say is it's really tricky. You know, desire and imitation and conflict scapegoating, it's almost like artificial intelligence. It will instantiate in new and new, more interesting, sinister iterations at each pass. So you might, not to discourage you,
yeah,
because I
yeah.
think you're probably going in the right direction, but one might think that they're not comparing themselves to the other, but there's a lot of subconscious stuff that's going on. And it's tricky because, like, in your uniqueness, you might be doing a particular thing that then the other person, and you might not be interested in comparing yourself at all, but then that other person might start to do that unique thing. And
Hmm.
as they do that, it drives the value of that unique thing up, which might then trigger you at some level to go, oh, I need to go after this a little bit harder,
Hmm.
which only, triggers them to go out after it harder. And it's this doubling, it's the symmetry of antagonism, and you start to become more and more like each other. So it's really tricky. And I think it's part of the answer, like we've already said, is just trying to be self-aware. And I
Yeah.
mean, hold our motivations loosely. I talk about that a lot. It's like, yeah, do you, be you. I'll just speak for myself. I'm trying to be me. I'm trying to do who I am, but not hold on to my motivations and desires so tightly that I assume that, yeah, I really am that unique and novel of a person.
Yeah.
Because I'm probably not, and that's a big deal for me
Yeah.
because I'm not deep into the Enneagram, but for any of the listeners who are, I'm probably a four, and the four is probably
Yeah.
the
Me too.
most into like the uniqueness piece.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah,
I'm very for. I think
yeah.
where I find I get into trouble is when I start defending people that I care about because I'm all emotions.
Mm.
And so I'll find myself fighting for people and I'm willing to like destroy people to fight for this person because I understand their pain in a way
I'm willing to
nobody else
destroy
does.
people.
And I'll go talk to the person I was defending and they're like, "Oh, that was really not a big deal." And I'm like, "I'm an idiot."
Maybe I was projecting some of my own stuff into that.
Yeah,
Yeah, yeah,
yeah. And so it's kind of funny. The warrior in me, it's like, okay, maybe I need to dial that down a bit.
maybe. But that is that a part of a four though, or is that just something
I
you thought of? Like you're saying,
fours are emotions.
are there more emotions? Oh, okay.
Yeah, and so it's like, and so I guess like, I guess there's different ways to four
Mm-hmm.
because it's like I'm the artist, but I'm always like trying to draw from the pain in the world, and
Yeah,
that's where I kind of try to learn other people's pain. I'm kind of
yeah.
I'm addicted to other people's pain.
That's
But kind of
interesting.
the nice thing about other people's pain is that I'm not in my own misery.
Mm-hmm.
I'm in someone
Mm-hmm.
else's misery, so I'm a hero.
Well, also, right. Well, a genuine nice thing too, without calling yourself a hero, is that you're probably um,
I'm saying that mockingly of myself,
I,
just to
I
be
know,
clear.
I know. But you probably have strong empathy skills. You're
Mhm.
probably able to relate to others, and you must there must be something about that woundedness that attracts you to it, and
Yeah.
that's a pretty cool move. That seems like a Jesus kind of a thing. So, yeah, that's fascinating.
Well, yeah, and it's knowing how to not overdo it. And it's funny too, because my buddy Dan King was talking to me about how it's like we were, in the 90s kids and youth group doing, singing worship. And it's like, God, break my heart for what breaks yours. And it's like, here I am. And it's like, yeah, why did I pray that? And I mean, I think we're seeing a lot of people leaving the church over that, where
Yeah,
it's like, well, I can see like my heart's breaking for what breaks God's. And I'm seeing all these people that are damaged by the church. And so I kind of hate the church right now. And I think
Yep.
that's what a lot of deconstruction is coming from.
Yep.
And then people within the church are saying, oh, they want to deconstruct because they want to sin. And it's like, okay, we've got a serious disconnect here.
Yeah, that's a serious disconnect for sure.
All right. So James Allison says, for God, there are no outsiders, which means that any mechanism for the creation of outsiders is automatically and simply a mechanism of human violence. Within the framework you propose, is there no exclusion?
Meaning, are there certain people that we should exclude?
Yeah. Like I guess what I'm saying is like, how do you ensure you're not enabling people to just take advantage of this inclusive community, and just continue to treat others poorly? Like, do we ever otherize for the sake of justice?
Yeah, that's a good set of questions you probably just um, begin to open up. So, what James Allison is talking about and what he's brilliant at is this whole idea that we tend to identify who we are over against who the other person is or isn't, and so it's real easy in church world to get into othering others because if we can clearly demarcate and say this is who they are and this is not good, this is bad, then we can say, oh, well, we're not that. And so clearly we are good. And what we do in, I think sometimes this is motivated, we have good intentions with this. We're trying to create some kind of identity and health. But what happens far too often is we create the 99 and then of course Jesus is out with the one. So the very
Yeah.
people that we're saying we're not like, we look around and we realize that's who Jesus is with. It's hilarious as well as tragic all at the same time.
I would say also like what you're saying, it applies to fundamentalism, but it also applies to woke fundamentalism.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
100%. It's a part of the way we operate. We there's nothing quite so powerful as unity for humans. And
Yeah.
but it's always, as Gerard says, it's always unity minus one. That's where it always leads
Ooh.
to, where we have to build up our own unity over against someone else at the sake of someone else. So we have to scapegoat them
That's
at some level. So
and
unity
that's
minus one.
that's totally what Brene Brown calls common enemy intimacy.
Oh, that's a good word too, a good
I
phrase.
love it too.
Common enemy intimacy. Yes.
Yeah.
So true. Now, another part of what I heard you asking is there a place for, well, I use the word identity, and I think that there is, that it's challenging because I do think we have to build spaces where we belong,
Yeah.
and where things are inclusive, but it's like I used to say when I pastored. I've pretty much pastored and church planted my whole life up until this past year, and I would try to talk about like how challenging it is to lead a faith community that wants to be known more for what it's for rather than for what it's against.
Mm.
It is
Yeah.
easier to lead a group when you really know what you're against. When you start breaking down all those boundaries and barriers, things get messy and gray. And you got to have really strong people. By the way, you got to be a really strong pastor too, to be able to wade into those waters because it's antithetical to the way that we've done church. So what I have tried to do and what I've continued to do, even though I don't continue to pastor, but in the work that I'm doing, is I've tried to keep that. That's the thing. I'm trying to build an identity of people who are more for things than against things, and to
Yeah.
talk about it and to talk about how difficult it is to do that and how it's easier to go the other way. So in a roundabout way, I'm still building identity, but it's really easy if you're not careful then to take all of that and begin to scapegoat someone else too. So the answer to your question is yes, but it's tricky.
Well, it's so interesting. I like the last week I did I was telling you I went to lectures, two-part lecture, William Jennings, and he was talking about reframing learning and reframing embodiment. And and a lot of it was talking about being good listeners as Christians instead of
Mm.
being teachers all the time, because that's what colonization was, is like, we're the teachers. And one of the things that, somebody had asked is like, well, how do we deal with people that are intolerant, really, is what they were asking, like these nasty people that have nasty opinions that are so harmful to people. And Jennings kind of looked at him and said, well, why don't you start with, where are you from? What's the nickname that your mama gave you?
Mm.
And I'm like, wow. Like, if we can actually recognize the humanity in the other, we're
Mhm.
actually drawing them in, and we're actually working to understand them instead of just figuring out how to cancel them, really.
Mhm. Mhm. Yeah, man, that's really good input, and I think it's true. Trying to break down some of those barriers that we automatically build up just so we can fight them. That doesn't that doesn't mean that there aren't boundaries sometimes, and
Yeah.
we do have to get better at that. But I love that whole idea of trying to diffuse the situation and figuring out, yeah, tell me your name, tell me your nickname, and
Yeah.
where do you come from? Tell me your story, man. What's the saying? The shortest distance between two people is your story, or something like that. Yeah, it's good.
Well, it's interesting. Like, the scapegoating mechanism is something like we don't just see in religious society. Like, I think we're seeing it within our society in general. And I hate it. Like, I hate to hear people always speak out against cancel culture, because I'm like, you're trying to say that we should just not care that this person did horrible things. But at the same time, I'm like, that's the scapegoating mechanism as well, because we're like, well,
100%. Yep.
we've purged our society of this one person that was causing all the problems, and then you kind of have your period where you're like, okay, we have peace now, we purged them. It's not really dealing with the issue, is it?
It's not really, and it's exacerbated because it's on social media. It makes it that much easier to do all that. I had a bit of a revelation this week with social media, which probably
Mm-hmm.
means I read this somewhere, because most of my revelations are I read it, so it's not original.
Mm-hmm.
But social media um, could be short for social mediation. So
Hmm.
when something is mediated to you, it is given to you. So my desires are mediated by the other. I don't create them on my own. They're created in relationship with the other person. Social media is social mediation. And when we see other people canceling, we have this strong desire to want to jump on board, to be a part of the in group. It feels powerful. It feels good to cancel. But you're 100% right. It's, or at least 99% right, because 99% of the time it serves no purpose. It's an exercise in us, trying to justify ourselves, get rid of the other person. And it's just weird because it's done online. It's like this strange concoction of a relationship. Anyhow, if we actually could sit down with a person, we might have a better chance, again, of getting to know their story and to talking about them, and then not have to make a big deal about even canceling them. Yeah, it probably says more about us than it does the other people. Anyhow, it's tricky. But it also, I always want to say that there are boundaries. There are people
Sure.
out there who have overstepped the boundaries, and so if listeners are tuning in and they have been genuinely hurt, there's a lot to wrestle with here. But they need to feel the right to be able to set up a boundary and not be around certain people. But I guess there's just a lot of inner work that needs to be done about how you do that. And if you're drawing so much attention to the process, it might say more about you than the other person at times.
Well, and I think too, like, when we talk about platform, and if you abuse your platform, it's like, well, maybe you should do something else, Like, it's
Mm-hmm.
like the
Mm-hmm.
Merc Driscolls, where it's like, no, but I have a gift to be a pastor. And it's like, well, I don't know. Have you tried woodworking? Like, just go do that.
Please, have you
Yeah.
tried anything other than what you're
Yeah.
doing?
Like,
Yes.
it's like, you don't have to be this big deal. Like, there's other things you can do with your life. And so it's like, once you've kind of abuse that power. I'm like, I'm not sure if restoration is always the thing. And it's like the kind of Christianity where it's always like, well, we should do restoration. And I think like that was a great kind of illustration. Like watching that, I learned so much because it was like, people are like, I think we should forgive Mark Driscoll. And I'm like, hold on, he didn't do anything to me.
Mm.
And so I'm like, so can we allow? And it's like, I actually, there was a guy who was talking about Sharia law, and I don't know how accurate this is, but he said that in one of the countries he lived in, it's like if somebody does something terrible to another person, the police arrest that person and then they bring them to the victim and they have them apologize.
Mm.
And the victim decides whether that apology is adequate or not.
Wow.
And if it's not adequate, they go to jail. And I'm like, we need to give power to those who've been violated.
Yeah.
Instead of all of us, like all of us warriors fighting for them all the time. It's like, well, maybe we should talk to the victim and have that hashed out. And then once that's hashed out, then we can talk about what does restoration look like.
Mm-hmm.
And do we just give Mark Driscoll, a power saw? Like, I don't know.
Well, yeah, you had, but not power saw. How about just a saw?
Yeah.
Why does he have to have so much power?
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's true. Okay. So you say surely God was capable of forgiveness previous to the execution of his son. I like this so much. I actually heard this at church one day too. It's like, you're already forgiven. And I'm like, that's so powerful. So, but without substitutionary atonement, what does the gospel become?
Without substitutionary atonement, the gospel becomes what it is meant to become, which is this inclusive movement of grace and mercy and love that is actively involved in our world and that wants to bring blessing and intends, for goodness to happen in relationship with us and with God. So substitutionary atonement, unfortunately for many, many folks, is the gospel. And I actually think it's the 100% complete opposite of the gospel. And it has done way, way more damage than it's done good. So without that, the gospel becomes what it's meant to be, or what I think it's meant to be.
It's beautiful. It's funny because I was talking to a Muslim friend and they're explaining Islam to me, and I'm just trying to be as open-minded as possible. Just be like, that's cool. And they kind of indicated to me that they're like, yeah, I pray 5 times a day because I need to make sure that everything is good with Allah. And I'm just kind of like, well, what if you're already forgiven though before you even do those 5 prayers? Like, what if you're already forgiven? And it's like, and those 5 prayers are for you, like to remind you that you're forgiven. And what if Allah is just sitting back and watching you pray and saying, I love it when he does this, And it's like, I feel like it works within so many frameworks where we can kind of like say, I think it frees us up in so many ways when we can say, I'm already forgiven. Because one of the things too, I'm just going to ramble again, but one of the things too that I've been thinking a lot about is like that Hillsong documentary. I don't know if you saw it.
I'm aware of it, but I haven't seen it. Yeah.
But there's like Brian Houston's father had molested a boy. That boy grew to be a man. And he was bringing up the fact that he had been abused, and Hillsong did a bunch of things to cover it up. But one of the things that I thought was really crazy was like Brian Houston's father had he said, I'm near death now, and if I give you $100,000, will you forgive me? Because I need to make things right with God. And it was right around the same time that I was listening to that song by DC Talk, Just Between You and Me. And in the bridge, they say, before I approach the throne, I must consider this. Offenses unresolved will keep me from the throne. And
Mm.
I'm like, I may have misquoted that, but I'm just like, okay, so I need to get things right with you because it's going to hurt my relationship with God. But if you have this, you've already been forgiven, it's all been done. Now we're not trying to keep good relationships with people just so that God is okay with us. We're actually trying to keep good relationships with people for the sake of keeping good relationships with people. And I think that fundamental shift really eliminates so much of the abuse and eliminates so much of the okaying of abuse, because it's like, no, legit, I need to make things right with this child that I abused. And it's like, I know you're angry with me and I have no idea how to make it right. I'm okay with you being angry with me because it's right for you to be angry with me. I ask for your forgiveness and I will wait as long as it takes.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, it seems to correct like so much of what I've seen as like the big problem.
Yeah, and it's back to the origin story too. I mean, if you start with this origin story that you're already okay with God, that doesn't mean that there aren't things you have to work on, or
No.
stuff you want to do better, or consequences in life, but that God has never turned his back on any of us. It alleviates so much of the strain and the pressure that church world feels like they have to put on everyone to convince them that they're bad in order to then turn around and tell them no, eventually God is good because of these reasons. It's convoluted and backwards. What if you just started with God is love, love has always been
Yeah.
with us, love is never going
Yeah.
to leave us, and it helps in so many situations.
Okay. Oh, I like this. Okay. You talk about apocalyptic literature.
Mm.
Michael Gorman says that apocalyptic literature both expresses and creates hope by offering scathing critique of oppressors, passionate exhortations to defiance, and unfailing confidence in God's ultimate defeat of present evil. Um, it's interesting to me because it's like we're not just saying like, oh, be afraid of the coming apocalypse. It's like actually calling us to action, isn't it?
Yeah, I think it's calling us to action. Open a relational theology. Once you start to get into it, you realize that oh, our actions matter and our choices matter, such that as we're being called to get into it, we are potentially preventing the apocalypse from happening.
Hmm.
So, in far too many instances, the coming violence that supposedly is, right around the corner is supposed to be the thing that, proves that the Bible is true, or that Christianity is true, or that God is whatever, rather than reading the whole thing in such a way that you would actually get involved in loving, peaceful, active ways in your world that it would prevent such violent apocalypse from happening. It's completely backwards.
Hmm.
So, yeah, the goal isn't to get ready for the apocalypse. The goal is to keep it from happening. And by the way, since we're talking about apocalypse, you know, the idea isn't the colloquial way we think of apocalypse is that it's this violent cataclysmic event, that ushers in some new age. Apocalyptic thinking is really just thinking that unveils new ideas. It's an
Hmm.
unveiling, is what it is. So we have co-opted the word, especially as in the West, because we're really into violence and we're really into punishment. We're really into top-down hierarchical, divine beings exacting punishment on others. So we love the word, but originally it wasn't necessarily. It could mean that, but in its purest form, it's an unveiling. It's a revealing of something new, and so the revealing of something new here is that, hey, if we'd start with this origin story of love and a God of love, it would make us all healthier, our systems healthier, our selves healthier, both intrapersonally and interpersonally, and it would help us usher in this new epic of health and life and consent. So, yeah, that always needs to be talked about with whenever the word apocalypse or revelation or any of those words kind of crop up.
I love that. It's just a much less scary world.
It's a right. It doesn't have to be the other way.
Yeah.
And what a strange way we were conditioned to read, like Jesus is the Prince of Peace. Well, the first time around, but the second time he comes back, he's taking names, kicking butt, and
Yeah.
he's got a sword coming out of his mouth. It's almost as if we told ourselves that what God thinks is, well, we tried it peaceful the first time, we tried it your way once, but this way, we're gonna do it God's way, and we're really gonna kill everyone and slaughter
Mm.
everyone, and it's a abhorrent way to read the scripture. It's an abhorrent way to live and to relate to the divine, and I just think it's, yeah, I don't think it's healthy.
Well, it's a big difference too. Like when you talk about like a father figure, and it's like, I'll be back later today. And if
Yep,
it's like a abusive father, you are terrified that they're coming back.
yep.
But if it's a dad that you love spending your time with, it's like, I'll be back later today. And it completely reframes it. And I'm like, I
Totally.
feel like that's what open relational theology is saying. It's like, I'll be back and you're going to want to hang out.
Yeah, yeah, for sure. There's a complete difference of reframing the story, and we desperately need reframing.
We do. Because, like I said, it all kind of just reverberates into our lives and makes us the kind of people we are.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So, however far the determining causal forces of the universe push to constraint a decision of any individual, there is always some range of possibilities open to it for its own self creativity, by which it puts a stamp on the world. So
Mm.
I love that quote, and I think it articulates the space within which this theology works. Like it feels like good parenting. It's like letting kids be themselves. Is that how you see it?
Yeah, I think so. I think in open relational thinking, we often talk a lot about, in every moment you get at least three things. You get options. You may not get a lot of options. And frankly, sometimes you may only get two. But I do, and there are people that will disagree with us on this, but I tend to think that you're always going to get at least something. You get agency. You get to choose, what which way you're going to go. Not always 100%. Sometimes you're going to feel compelled and forced in certain ways, but there is a measure of agency that's involved. So you get options and agency, and oh gosh, the third one has just escaped my mind. Sorry, I said it backwards. But anyhow, in the middle of all that, God is with us with options and agency. And so God's not forcing us. God hasn't predetermined the way future is going to play out. Actually, the future is an unknown quantity, so there's no way to exactly know for anyone because it's not happened yet, and it's built upon a multiplicity of factors that could be happening moment by moment, depending on your choices and other people's choices and the options that are available. So all of that plays into it, and I can't remember what the question was now.
Talking about parenting and like
Oh,
allowing your kids to be themselves.
yeah, yeah.
Yeah,
And so I think consent. So I think the best thing we can say about God is that God is love.
yeah,
And by the way, when I say that, I realize that lots of different people might have different ideas of what love is. So in my work, I've had to, for myself, redefine and reframe it. But I think the best thing is love, and the fundamental characteristic of love is consent,
yeah.
and that consent is incredibly powerful. And
Hmm.
if we do say that about healthy parents, we do say in so many words, we want to be the kind of people that allow our kids to grow up and to be whoever they, choose to be. We hope they don't make such mistakes that, they hurt themselves or hurt others, but we know we can't force them. I mean, if
Yeah.
you've been a parent, you realize really quick, like maybe in a matter of days, for sure by age 2, you can't force these kids to do anything. And we don't want our kids to be codependent. And so I even say that in the book, like, why, if we were to look at a an adult child and say, oh well, they're still dependent upon their parents to make decisions, if we were to look upon that and think that that's not healthy, why do we do that with God? Why do
Mm,
we put ourselves in situations where we say, oh, we're waiting for God to control this situation or use us or give us the one right answer? That just creates codependent people. And I don't see Jesus necessarily acting that way. I see a lot of consent. So, yeah, to your point, it's a healthy way to parent. It's harder to parent that way. It
yeah.
really is easier to tell people what to do,
Yeah.
and it's easier to run a church where you just figure out all the rules and you hang on to them in dogmatic ways through the centuries, irrespective of how science changes and how the ecology changes and the world changes. It's just easier to hang on to what we used to do.
Yeah.
But I don't think it's the move of love. I think the move of love is constantly in the middle of options and agency and trying to help us make and take the next best step, even when it's not always an easy thing.
Yeah. All right. One last quote, and it's Martin Luther King.
Okay.
Um, I love this quote so much. I posted it on Facebook too. I'm like, it's great. The ultimate weakness of violence is that it is a descending spiral, begetting the very thing it seeks to destroy. Instead of diminishing evil, it multiplies it. Through violence, you may murder the liar, but you cannot murder the lie, nor establish the truth. Through violence, you may murder the hater, but you do not murder the hate. In fact, violence merely increases hate. So it goes. Returning violence for violence multiplies violence, adding deeper darkness to a night already devoid of stars. Darkness cannot drive out darkness. Only light can do that. Hate cannot drive out hate. Only love can do that. So this really goes against everything fundamentalism teaches, doesn't it?
Mm-hmm. It goes against the way I think we're wired in general,
Yeah,
or the way we've wired ourselves in general. It's
yeah,
yeah, it's such beautiful writing and
it
such
is.
challenging words, and I don't know how anyone could disagree with or not resonate with what MLK Jr. is saying there. It's so beautiful.
Yeah. And I think like it's almost like we have this propensity for violence and it's such a weird thing that's innate. Like it's like why do we get so excited by violence? Like why is there so much violence in television? Like I remember when Alec Baldwin accidentally shot that person in, it was somebody on set, right? And
Mm-hmm.
there's the whole thing and I'm like sitting here like, well, why do we have all these like movies and TV shows with guns in them to begin with? Like it's just an obsession and we're willing to say, well, it's just part of society.
Yeah, I think a Girardian way to approach that is to say, well, we have ordered ourselves around violence. You
Yeah.
know, um, our religious system is built upon scapegoating. Scapegoating is built upon sacrifice and victimization. So for Girard, sacrifice is the cornerstone of our culture, which is interesting because Jesus, becomes a stumbling block, depending on where you're reading at in the New Testament. He's the cornerstone now. It's a new type of cornerstone, and it's a stumbling block to those who have built upon the other cornerstone. And it's a stumbling block that says it's a way of life living that says we're going to get to peace by way of standing with the victim rather than get to peace by way of standing against the victim.
Hmm.
We're going to be culpable and admit our own violent tendencies in order to be with those who have been oppressed. So why is there so much violence? In part, I think it's because we've ordered, we've structured the whole world around violence, and our imagination has been captivated by violence, and we at times seem to have no other imagination, no other way to get to where we want to go other than by living by the myth of what I say in the writing, the myth of redemptive sacrifice, which is just really a play on Walter Wink's phrase, the myth of redemptive violence. I just try to
Hmm.
dial it in a little bit more specific and say sacrifice. So it's a huge problem. Not only, by the way, some people might be listening and say, "Well, I'm not a violent person," which I have said that too at times. I
Yeah.
don't feel like I'm a violent person, but
Yeah.
the more I hang out with love and the more I'm around the light and the light shines in my life, I realize, oh, there are some violent tendencies I have. And B, it might miss the real violence, and the real violence happens systemically. It
Mm.
may not be individually. So when I'm a part of systemic injustice, it's definitely doing violence to people, and so that's a messier, trickier subject. But if we can be humble, we can realize a lot of us are culpable in this stuff. It's challenging.
Well, I think it's like changes the way that we approach um, dealing with injustice too. I used to listen to Revolution Church or Revolution Gathering with Jay Baker.
Okay.
And one of the talks he gave, he said, we need to keep each other from becoming monsters.
Mm.
And I like that as an approach so much better than I'm going to keep you accountable, right? Like, it's like, I'm just trying to keep you from becoming a monster. And it's a much more compassionate way of dealing with someone who could potentially be the perpetrator, right?
Yeah, could be. Yeah.
All right. So I had so many questions and I didn't get to all of them, but I'm wondering if there's anything we didn't cover that you would like to talk about before we're done.
Well, there's a lot of stuff we didn't cover,
Yeah.
but you've done a really good job. You've asked good questions, and I
Oh,
think you've
thank
gotten
you.
to the heart of a bunch of it. And what I hope is that people will just pick the book up or listen to the
Mm-hmm.
podcast or find me online, and not because what I write in and of itself is so great, but because these two venerable concepts, mimetic theory and open relational theology, bring so much, I think, health and insight into the world. So it's worthy of wrestling with. So hopefully folks can pick a copy up.
Well, I think more than anything, it's like you've kind of drawn together multiple works, which really
Mm-hmm.
speak to the people that have done those works.
Mm-hmm.
And so I see it kind of as a tribute in a lot of ways.
Yeah,
And so it's like it's worth reading for that reason. And then the way you tie it together, it's I think it's revolutionary. So I'm
well,
excited to see how this does.
I
Um,
appreciate it, man.
yeah. Okay, so we can add to the show notes a link to your podcast and then
Cool.
your book. I usually just do links to Amazon, but is there a better
Sure.
link than that? Or are you good with that?
No, I don't need to support Amazon anymore. But on the other hand, I mean, they have such a stranglehold on everything that if you don't do well on Amazon, you're not going to do well anywhere else. So, yeah, you could put a link there. That'd be great.
And I'll link to your website too.
Cool, man.
All right. Well, thank you. And we'll
Thank
have
you.
to
I
do
appreciate
this
it.
again sometime.
Absolutely. It's been a lot of fun, and I really appreciate your time.
Air Smudge.